All right. Thank you very much, Kathy. And I'm going to trust that everybody can hear me. So good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, even to all our listeners, wherever you happen to be. I've learned so much over the years from Kathy's books, articles, and style as a politically engaged scholar. In my 10 minutes or so, I won't go quite that long, I want to try to build on her reflections on voting in two ways. The presentation you just heard draws on two chapters that Kathy published in 2012 and 2020. I read the 2020 chapter first, and it struck me as written for our moment. Surely Kathy is right. We select among candidates, not among abstract stands on issues. And especially in this presidential election, we need to focus on the candidates' 1, competence, 2, character, 3, capacity to collaborate, and 4, connections, not least conflicts of interest that might lead a president to act in ways that serve himself rather than the national interest. But then I read Kathy's 2012 chapter and discovered that she had argued then too against a blinkered focus on issues. My first thought was she was incredibly prescient. My second thought, though, was to wonder whether the 4 considerations that Kathy proposes really do suffice for our moment after all. And here I should thank my colleague Regan Reitzma, who pushed my thinking along. Kathy writes in both her 2012 and 2020 chapters that the point of electing candidates to an office is to empower and to enable them to accomplish a set of tasks in service of the common good. She also cites Niccolo Machiavelli, whom students may have read in Philosophy 101. In his book, The Prince, Machiavelli proposes to analyze not how we imagine republics should be, which he suggests is what earlier philosophers had done, but the brute facts about them. Students and everyone else should feel free, of course, to disagree with me, but I wonder if one brute fact about our republic in 2020 is that our current leader is not interested in the common good, but cares only about the interests of his so-called base of supporters. By common good, understand goods that can be had only in common, also known as irreducibly social goods. I think we don't adequately appreciate how important common goods are for fulfilling human lives. Take as examples the goods of friendship, family, and marriage, or for that matter, parties, conversations, and college classes. A further example is a political society like a republic, which in its Latin roots means public thing, or we might say thing of the people. Now, a remarkable fact about a common good is that a sure way to destroy it is to be in it, so to speak, only for yourself. Consider what that would do to a friendship or to a marriage. After the Constitutional Convention in 1787, my fellow Philadelphian, Benjamin Franklin, is reputed to have answered the question, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" with the rejoinder, "A republic, if you can keep it." Leaders who don't care about the common good of our political society imperil our political society to the detriment of us all. The upshot is that I propose a 5th consideration to Kathy's 4. We need to consider whether candidates have any conception of and commitment to the common good. In brief, do they want to help us keep the republic that the Constitutional Convention gave us, or are they in it only for themselves? Against that background, I can propose a 6th consideration more simply. In 2020, we also need to consider whether the candidates are committed to basic democratic norms like free and fair elections and the peaceful transfer of power. So the first way I want to build on Kathy's reflections is by adding, for our moment, 2 further considerations to her 4. To repeat, voters should consider not only candidates 1, competence, 2, character, 3, capacity to collaborate, and 4, connections, but also 5, whether they have any conception of and commitment to the common good, and 6, whether they are committed to basic democratic norms. The second way I want to try to build on Kathy's reflections is by developing an objection to them, but then showing that this objection in fact supports her criticism of how the US bishops have tried to shape Catholic voters. And by the way, I should note that Bishop Robert McElroy of San Diego has been a vocal exception to the rule.
Mhm.
There are two paths to try to overturn the constitutional right to abortion recognized by the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 and affirmed with modifications by Casey versus Planned Parenthood in 1992. The first path is direct, namely to seek a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion. But it is very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. The great majority of proposed amendments fail. That difficulty, as Kathy notes, has led the pro-life movement, including the U.S. bishops, to pursue the second path, which is indirect, namely to try to elect presidents who over time will remake the Supreme Court with justices able and willing to overturn Roe. The U.S. bishops' decision to make abortion our preeminent priority, as they call it, means that, according to the bishops, Catholics can vote in clear conscience for a pro-choice candidate only if there is no pro-life candidate or if the pro-life candidate would be a disaster on other grounds. In her 2012 chapter, Kathy calls that strategy into question. She notes that no president can control how many appointments he or she will have to the Supreme Court, or whether the Senate will confirm his or her nominees, or how a justice votes after being appointed, or whether the court will agree to hear a case that would allow it to overturn Roe, or whether the justices would be willing to overturn Roe after all, which likely would generate significant social instability, given that public opinion strongly opposes overturning Roe, and that generations have now come of age presuming the legality of abortion. The counter to Kathy's criticism of the bishops is, behold, the strategy appears to be working. President Trump has already appointed two justices, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, and now the president has nominated a third justice in Amy Coney Barrett. It's clear from Judge Barrett's academic publications that she is no great respecter of either precedent in general or Roe in particular. Should she be confirmed by the Senate, there is a good chance that the constitutional right to abortion might finally be undone, especially if President Trump is able to replace, in the second term as president, Justices Clarence Thomas and Stephen Breyer. To restate then the counter to Kathy, is this not strong reason to affirm the bishop's guidance of Catholic voters? Let me close by briefly explaining why I think the answer is no. The bishop's guidance is not well advised. Kathy's criticism is well founded. For what it's worth, I agree with the bishops that the issue of abortion is both important and urgent, to use Kathy's terms. Let's say that Roe is overturned. The legality of abortion then goes back to the states. How do the bishops propose to prohibit abortion in, for example, Pennsylvania? The bishops currently hope to win the culture war over abortion through the Supreme Court. But surely culture wars have to be won by engaging with, well, the culture, as Pope Francis seems to understand. In 1997, the Supreme Court declined to recognize the constitutional right to physician-assisted suicide. To date, 8 states and the District of Columbia have permitted physician-assisted suicide. The Catholic Church seems to be losing that culture war. The Church is also losing Catholics. According to the Pew Research Center, more than half of U.S. adults raised as Catholics have left the Church at some point, most never to return. One of the main drivers of the growth of religious non-affiliation is the association of religion with countercultural reactionary politics. So let's be clear. Some Catholics are genuinely struggling with how to vote. Some, under the guidance of the U.S. bishops, feel obligated to vote for President Trump because he will put right-wing justices on the court. My prediction is the more closely the bishops associate the church with countercultural reactionary politics, the less capacity the church will have to foster in the United States a culture of life, regarding human life as precious and worthy of protection and support from beginning to end. The church will win, perhaps, in court to lose badly in culture. As a Catholic, I think that would be a terrible outcome. I want to thank Kathy for her incisive, doggedly hopeful work. And now it's time for Christo Huntington to put a few questions to her.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss such an important topic this afternoon, everyone. For the next few minutes, I'd like to share a few thoughts regarding Dr. Kaveny's presentation and build on Dr. Prusak's comments. I'd like to discuss 3 main points. A, how to prompt young voters to think along the lines that Dr. Kaveny suggests. B, voting guides versus issue guides. And C, Dr. Kaveny's suggestion for the church and for the pro-life movement regarding Roe v. Wade. Although I wasn't old enough to vote in the 2016 presidential election, I understood the significance of the election because it was the first time in my lifetime that a non-politician was on the ballot for one of the two major political parties. After President Trump was elected, it felt as though the political arena was thrown into a whirlwind because an untraditional candidate and television personality was now in charge of our nation and possessed the nuclear codes. Looking back at 2016, I can now see how a comparison of the two leading candidates, according to Dr. Kaveny's 4 considerations, as mentioned before, competence, character, capacity to collaborate, and connections, could have guided voters to cast their ballots for Hillary Clinton. Yet, Donald Trump won. In my opinion, the results of the 2016 election play perfectly into Dr. Kaveny's claim that people vote for candidates, not the issues. Donald Trump was the vocal, unforgiving critic of traditional politicians. His raw, unfiltered personality appealed to many anti-politician voters. It made him, quote, one of us for many Americans. Although he did not stack up against other Republican politicians particularly well in the Republican primary on Dr. Kaveny's 4 considerations, he got voters to choose him for the Republican nomination. This leads to my first question for Dr. Kaveny. How can I, or others my age, prompt young voters to think critically about the candidate's qualifications instead of irrationally voting or not voting at all? In her 2020 chapter that Dr. Prusak discussed, Dr. Kaveny also argues that the voting guides issued by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops are, quote, missed opportunities because they are framed as issue guides, not voting guides. My next question involves your perspective on the possible conflict between religion and politics if the USCCB or USSCB were to issue voting guides focused on candidates' character, competence, and so on. Should the church, specifically the bishops, get involved in explicit comparative and contextual analyses of political candidates? Would this analysis be getting too deep into politics? And should the church get that deep? Issue guides can simply outline what the candidates say or believe, but a voting guide that reflects on the general qualifications of a candidate, like competence, collaborative abilities, connections, and character, would be a greater task and might create tension within the church. The final topic I'd like to discuss has to do with Roe v. Wade. As we heard Dr. Prusak discuss, Dr. Kaveny is critical of the pro-life movement's indirect strategy of making abortion a litmus test issue for presidential candidates. So, Dr. Kaveny, my final question. Do you think that the more direct path to overturning Roe, namely a constitutional amendment, is the correct path forward for the Catholic Church and the pro-life movement? If so, how should the church go about fostering a cultural change, which Dr. Prusak mentioned, within the United States so that the amendment gains enough popularity? Finally, what do you think the strategy should be for religious groups if Roe v. Wade is overturned and the legality of abortion goes back to the states? Thank you all for your time and willingness to participate in this discussion.
Thank you. Should I respond now? Is this what the, or are we taking more questions? Just a little clarification.
Respond now to Christo, if you would, and then Margarita will come and pose questions from the chat.
Okay, and to Bernard as well, I think, right?
Sure.
Okay, I'm just so grateful for anybody of Bernard's deep intelligence, deep learning, and moral wisdom, taking the time to read anything I've written. It's really the greatest joy that a writer can have, is to have somebody actually read what you wrote and think about it. Writing is such a lonely business, and having somebody engage and constructively criticize what I've written is just it's just a delight. And so I would just like to briefly respond to some of his points. I think that the addition of the two criteria, do candidates have a commitment to the common good? Are people committed to, to the, basic norms of the tradition? All of those, both of those points are really right on target. And the only thing I can say, or excuse me, the basic commitments of our democratic government, that was the second point, are right on target. The only thing I can say is it didn't occur to me that we would have candidates who wouldn't at least make a colorable claim to being committed to the common good, although they might understand it differently, or that they would be candidates calling into question our, the norms of our democratic representative democracy. That wasn't even on the page for me. That wasn't even a tiny glimmer in my mind when I was writing, the book in 2012. So I didn't see that coming. So maybe I was a little bit prescient, but I could have used a telescope to see what we were facing right now. So I totally agree on the fifth and sixth criteria. On your objection, this is really an interesting situation. And I suppose in a way I was wrong about this as well. At the time I was writing Law's Virtue in 2012, it didn't seem very likely that the strategy to put presidents on the Supreme Court, for presidents to put people on the Supreme Court who would ban abortion would actually work. And I do agree that it looks like it's working now. It's very odd. I mean, it's sort of a combination of Trump, who I think really is willing to do that. I always, in some sense, doubted the commitment of some of the other presidents to really putting on people who would be very aggressive against Roe v. Wade. But I do think that Amy Coney Barrett is very committed on this score. And if she's put on the court, there will be enough votes to dramatically trim back or overturn Roe. So I didn't see this coming. I mean, it involved, in my defense, a lot of odd things happening. Trump winning the election, due to the Electoral College, despite the fact that he lost the popular vote. Trump's connection to some of the Federalist Society people in terms of naming judges. I think other Republican presidents would have been more independent about that. And then, the timing of the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all of that is, are contingencies, singular events that have worked together to put us at this moment. And I agree with your response to some degree, except I'd like to caution that, and this is another lecture, another talk, I don't think the bishops have really considered the harm that will be done to other aspects of Catholic social teaching by an originalist theory of constitutional interpretation, such as the Affordable Care Act going down, other sorts of things, the preeminence of gun rights. I'm not an originalist. I don't actually think it's a coherent theory of constitutional interpretation. And I think that it bears more resemblance to a fundamentalist approach to interpreting scripture than it does to a Catholic approach to interpreting scripture, which recognizes that it's a unique kind of document and that intent has to play a different role in interpreting these founding texts, sacred texts to a community, either a religious community or our political community. But I think that there's going to be quite a lot lost. So even if you were just focusing on Supreme Court justices, I think you need to ask, what is a court that is going to be ruling in such an aggressively originalist way going to do to the common good, to the well-being of the vulnerable? And I don't think it works very well. If you focus on, say Roe v. Wade is overturned and the issue is returned to the states, then I think you've got another set of problems. I think there's, I think people are very ambivalent about abortion. And I think there's a reason that they're ambivalent about abortion. One way of framing the abortion issue is that it's intentional killing of the innocent. And you can certainly see that framing. That's the framing that the church takes. But it's a unique kind of situation because there's no other kind of situation where avoiding intentional killing requires somebody to provide bodily life support to another person, at the, at significant physical costs sometimes. I always point out that, if you have a dad, say, who's the same blood type as his baby, and the only way you can save the baby's life is by giving blood to the baby, the law does not require the dad to give blood to the baby to save life. So we've got a framework, we've got an issue here which is really complicated because it can be framed understandably in these two ways, and I think that's why Americans remain ambivalent about the issue of abortion. Which means it's going to be very hard to come up with a coherent plan to regulate. Very many abortions are performed early in pregnancy. There are, chemical abortions, abortions by taking pills. It's going to be very hard to stop that from being shipped across state lines. I don't think you're going to be able to stop people from, going to New York or Massachusetts or California or states where the abortions are performed. So I think you need to focus on the demand for abortion, not just the supply of abortion, because I think there will always be a supply of abortion one way or the other. And I think the benefit of John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, which I think was in a way hijacked by the American culture wars, was to say, look, the interesting and important thing about vulnerable people, whether they are very old or very young or are people with disabilities, is that it's not enough simply to leave them alone. It's great. If you're 25 years old, you're in college, 18, you're at the peak of your physical health. You are fine if nobody harms you. But for the very vulnerable, we also need to provide help. And the big problem in pregnancy, it seems to me, and in crisis pregnancy, is that the most vulnerable, the unborn, are very dependent upon people only slightly less vulnerable than themselves. And grappling with that problem is going to require not simply stopping killing of the unborn, but enabling women and supporting the women that carry those pregnancies to term. I also fear, I have to say, that if like Bernard, if the church it's so identified with this very conservative vision of what culture should be, what politics should be, and an increasingly authoritarian one as well, I think there will be a backlash. We may not live to see it, but I think it will come. And I think the best example is what happened in Ireland. Ireland was, and in Quebec. Ireland and Quebec were both very religiously controlled nations or polities. The church had an outsized role in determining the social structure of the place. But it rotted from the inside because it couldn't communicate the real values that were at stake there. It was just an imposition of force, and the hypocrisy was so evident. So when Ireland overturned the church, it really overturned it. The same thing with Quebec. I think we need to think about that. With respect to Christopher, I think you've got some great questions. Why did Trump win? What are the characteristics that people are thinking about? Well, I think that really shows that, there's a lot more work to be done by ethicists on what do we mean by character? Not simply maybe these 4 virtues, but also do you have vices that impede people from from seeing what you're about. So I think, if you read the data, people saw Hillary Clinton as having contempt for them. A lot of the people that voted for Trump, as really just giving them lip service, and as really focused on just the well-being of cultural elites on both coasts, rather than the well-being of people in the middle. So what character means, I think, is more than just an abstract articulation of it, but really looking at, are you for all of us in some ways? Religion, and how can you prompt people your age to vote rationally? I think you have to teach them. Tell them it's an obligation. I don't think you can tell people how to vote. I really think that doesn't work. But I think you can have discussions about, well, what should you think about? What should people your age think about? Are the issues that are important to you being represented? Everything I study says that climate is a particularly important issue to young people. The economic situation in terms of access to jobs should be important. But also, the situation of very old people and even their parents. If all of Social Security if all the government is going to be consumed paying for the older people in justice, who's going to take care of the younger people? We need to think about those too. So I think raising the questions as a vivid problem, not simply as, I go into a voting booth and one person does exactly what the other one does. Well, if the 2016 election taught us anything, it's that no, all candidates aren't fungible. Religion and politics, should we mix the vote? Should the bishops be engaged in voting guides? Is that going to mix the two too much? Especially if they focus on characters and character traits rather than issues. Well, I don't think any voting guide can or should run down an official voting guide. Here are the strengths and weaknesses of Trump versus here are the strengths and weaknesses of Biden. But I think you can develop general criteria, like what does it mean to be prudent? In a way that can be applied by Catholics to the candidates that they're thinking about. And that's not just the president, right? There's all sorts of local elections that are really important as well. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that, states matter. The governor matters. The philosophy that's adopted at the level of the state is going to make a big difference to the public health of the community. So I think you can come up with criteria that are more general. The third point, do I think the direct path is the correct path on overturning Roe? I think at this point we have to wait and see what happens. I don't think there is an abstractly correct path. I think right now we are in a situation where we don't know what's going to happen. But what I really do think the strategy of religious groups should be is really, if Roe is overturned, not simply to focus on criminal prohibition. There's a lot in Catholic legal theory, particularly the thought of Thomas Aquinas, that says if you impose a law that's too harsh, that's too difficult for the people to bear, there's going to be a rebellion against it, and you're going to end up in a worse situation than you were at the beginning. And an example in American life of that, of course, is prohibition. People were trying to get rid of that demon drink for all sorts of good reasons, but that was not in accordance with the mores and the judgments and the capabilities of most people. So you had a tremendous backlash. So I think prudence is a good thing. And I think focusing, especially on providing women with the resources where they can carry the baby to term is the better way to go. I think the problem with the way the church has talked about abortion is that you've got a baby in a disembodied context. The womb cuts off everything else. But really what you want to encourage is a relationship between mother and baby, and to encourage a selfless in some ways and a giving and a joyous relationship between mother and baby in the context of a crisis pregnancy. I don't think just simply threatening women or, as probably would happen here, doctors with legal prohibitions is going to help much. It's not going to do anything at all. It's just going to leave a lot of desperate women, I believe. Okay, I think I've done everything you've asked me to do so far, and I'm waiting for the next set of questions.